welcome to the LearnOps Leadership Series. With me today, I have Kirk Werner, who's the Vice President of Content at Udacity. Kirk has also played Director of Content roles at Coupa, as well as content and production and overseeing instructional design at LinkedIn. And previously, before that, worked at companies like lynda.com and McGraw-Hill. Kirk's really well known for scaling teams, scaling business operations and business processes when it comes to content production and learning and development. And thanks, Kirk, for joining today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I've known you for a while, but I've never really asked you how you even got into content production or learning and development. I would love to hear your story.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. My story is a relatively simple one, and I think that there's a lot of parallels to a lot of other people who are in this industry now. I originally was going to be a classroom teacher. My father was in teaching for 20 plus years, classroom teacher and a principal. And so growing up, I always thought I'd be a teacher. And I went to college and had a professor who told me, don't go teach in high school or grade school, go to college, get a graduate degree, teach, be a PhD. And so I actually went and got a master's degree in American intellectual history and thought I'm going to work to a PhD, and realized that most professors aren't interested in teaching, but that's what I wanted to do. So I did substitute teaching for a while. I coached for a while, but then I realized that maybe I'm better suited to work kind of feeding information to teachers. And so I got into publishing. I worked in book publishing for a number of years, but it was at a time when book publishing was starting to acknowledge that there was technology in the area, that there were websites you could build, that ebooks were starting to be a thing, that technology could live alongside of the text and help enhance the learning experience. And so as one of the youngest members of an editorial team, I ended up becoming somewhat of a technology editor as well as a content editor. And so I started putting technology in the backs of books, the CD in the back of the book model, even before we put in websites, building technology content for world history or geography. I transitioned into doing it for things like accounting content, and even partnering with companies like Microsoft to help teach Office back in the late 90s. So I started thinking about content differently. I started thinking about content not as build a book, but build content and then think about the medium afterwards. The medium can be different. You can build the same content for multiple mediums. And so I went to work for another publishing company, but almost in a completely technological side of things, where, yes, I had a book list, but I also had a website list that I was in charge of, and converting all of our printed content into electronic content to serve onto that website. So building an ingestion process for a print development that would then serve multiple outputs, multiple media. And so I really started thinking about the medium being less important except to the consuming learner at the end, but building from a standpoint of the content is critical. And then we find the medium afterwards, rather than building the content only for a single medium. And so that really kind of changed the way I thought about it. And one of the things that I went to afterwards is I found a company called lynda.com. They were relatively small at the time, only about 35 or 40 people in 2008. And started thinking about content as a visual video development process. 2008 was really early in that process. Lynda.com had just recently stopped producing, or in that year, we stopped producing books and stopped producing CDs, literally, I think that year or the year after. And we were only online. Speeds in 2008 weren't great. And so it affected how many people could consume the video. But it was really early to get into the mode of what is video content and how do you convey training through a video medium rather than just the camera in the back of the room model. How can you really use the tools to be a better way of conveying information? And so that's kind of how I got my start, moving from print to digital to electronic, and really playing in different modalities depending on what kind of content is there. Um, After years of building the content, I really wanted to get into how are people consuming it? How do companies really think about the content, the training content inside their companies? And so that's when I went to work after Linda had been acquired by LinkedIn. LinkedIn had been acquired by Microsoft. I took a sidebar and I went to work for a company called Coupa in their kind of content development, but learning and development space, building the learning and development content not only for our internal employees but also for our customers. And so teaching people about Coupa, but also building leadership and interviewing content for our internal use. Because I had the experience of building content, and I had some production experience, I actually built a small little production studio that we could shoot our own courses in, and actually had that kind of cross experience of internal and external usage, which I think was great.
That's really cool. So, something that's interesting from your story, you in being part of lynda.com, which was an early innovator of, and transformed digitally how video was done, especially from a training perspective, and now looking at the world today, we're definitely going through this next phase of digital transformation. Definitely and particularly within learning and development, a lot of it has been accelerated as well, as because of the pandemic and whatnot. So, being through a major shift in the past, and then, fast forward to the shift we're going through today, what are you seeing in the industry that's changing over the last few years? And maybe share some thoughts on where you see it heading.
Yeah, it used to be that if you could put content in front of people, you could win. And it didn't matter how great it was. It didn't matter what it was about or how it was presented. It was, oh, you can get content in front of people, you could win. I think that curation has become one of the most important things now. How is your content attached to other content? How is it validated that it's the best possible way of conveying the content? And so quality of instruction has really kind of taken to the forefront, and curation of content has really come to the forefront, where originally you could just bury people in like, here's a great course and it's 14 hours long, but you'll take it because it's the only way you can consume it. I think that curation and quality have really taken a forefront, but it's also gotten a lot easier to build content. It was a process back in the early 2000s about how to build electronic content or digital content that could be conveyed on the web, on a website. It's a lot easier now to build a video and throw it up on YouTube and tell people this is great stuff. And so that's why curation even comes more important. Being able to identify, here's a good learning story, here's a good pedagogical process to build great content, and this is why this content is better than that content. It's going to actually have outcomes rather than just what I call lean back education, where I sit and watch a video for a few hours or a few minutes. I'm actually leaning into it. I'm doing something. I'm engaged in the process. And so I'm actually activating more of my intellectual senses, my learning experience, than just watching a video. And so I think that's the biggest difference that I've seen. I think that's one of the biggest differences that I've seen recently, is being able to convey more than just I put content in front of people, and it's more now I'm putting activated content in front of people who are engaged learners and are actually developing an outcome out of it. That I think is one of the biggest problems, the biggest solutions that I've seen recently that make a big difference.
No, and I would agree as well. But we're seeing a lot of shift in L&D operating models. From centralization to decentralization to federated. Given the speed that the industry is now moving in, and all this transformation's happening, like, where do you think L&D operating models are optimized? How do you think they should be structured from with what you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the companies that I've worked with have had different models of engaging with their customers. Some of the companies have been more driven directly into the L&D space and talking directly to the chief learning officers or chief HR officers, chief people teams. And others have gone more the line of business, have gone more directly to the technology teams, the data teams, the accounting departments, the finance departments, and have them invest in the training directly rather than going to an HR team. And ultimately, the best solution is one that takes advantage of both of those things. Is that oftentimes you want to make sure that you're engaging with the learners and the leader of those learners who are going to be looking for the outcomes, as well as the teams who are going to have to administrate that work and see more global outcomes for an organization. Because you can be a really successful tool that only speaks to a particular kind of decentralized learning leader, but you're missing the opportunity for the other 10 teams that could also get value from the solution. And so if you're going to be decentralized, you've got to have these kind of cross purposes meetings on a regular basis where if I'm working in the marketing team and you're working in the data team, that we have conversations about, hey, my learners are looking for something like this. Do you have something? So that I don't build the exact same thing that you're building. So having that kind of where you can't build, I believe the centralized team that does all the building is probably done, but I think that the decentralized supported teams that are dotted line connected is actually the more successful solution, because everyone's still talking, but they're closer to the learners who are actually doing the learning.
Mm-hmm. From a partnership model. And then it's easier to obviously be outcomes focused when you can work directly with the group or the partners who are having the problems.
Yeah. You can have that conversation to say, I think this is the most effective way of communicating this concept and this outcome to your team, but let's work through this. And maybe your team needs something that's more, from a modality point of view, your team maybe needs something that's more print-based or quick videos or a longer term kind of piece of content. It's better to have that conversation direct and then be able to modify the medium to fit the learner. The content can still be the same pool of content. Everyone's working from the same pool, but the medium becomes different. How you deliver it becomes different. You're filling their actual needs rather than anticipating a need that you might not be able to address.
Yeah, that makes sense. And something else that's interesting about your background, you'd categorize yourself as well as a product leader, right? And I think that's really interesting too, because of how L&D teams are transforming how they're thinking. So you're kind of ahead of the curve, having a bit of a product background, and then the type of content you've built and the processes you've embedded at Udacity, being a product company, and the content is part of the product. I would say you're probably ahead of where the traditional industry has been, and you have been for quite some time. So, being a product leader, like how do you operate your processes, versus what you've seen other L&D teams do? Like, what are some of the best practices you've taken from product management and applied it to what you've been building?
Yeah, there's two big ones that kind of jump to mind immediately. And one of them is being data-driven as much as possible. Not necessarily the data that you get from, 5 conversations, but seeing what learners are doing in the classroom and seeing exactly what they're doing, how long they're pausing at certain areas, when they're engaging, what are they skipping, looking back to that kind of data to drive not only how I adjust the existing content, how do I make the next thing and the next thing? And being able to bucket personas of those learners into various areas so that you're talking about the right persona and delivering the right content to them at the right time, rather than kind of a one size fits all kind of point of view. So using a lot of data around what the learners are doing to help you understand the next and the next and the next. And being in this kind of constant state of development, rather than I built it and I push it out and I just I'll come back to it in 6 months. I'm constantly looking at things. And the other is understanding that the product of the content itself, the product of whatever it is you're doing, is so inextricably linked to the content, but they're not the same. The product and the content are separate things. The modality of what you're delivering is different than the content, but they are linked. And so having an understanding of how those two things interact. Do I need to um, provide a localized version of this, or can I provide it all in English with just maybe some subtitles in Spanish? Do I have to localize, or do I have to bring, how does accessibility work inside of the courses that I'm building? Thinking of it more holistically than just I'm building content and somebody else is delivering it, but like the whole thing is actually part of a delivered product. And I think that part of that comes from being in the book world and thinking about how many pages and what kind of paper, how big of a spine did I need, thinking about that physical object, made me think about a product as well as the words and the pictures and the images and the questions that were inside of it.
Now that makes a lot of sense as well. And so you're really focusing on the experience. So when designing the content, at what stage or what process are you operating in order to really hone in on the experience while you're thinking about the outcomes as well?
It starts at the very beginning. I think that you have to think about the learner journey and the actual ways they're interacting with the content right from the very beginning. Ultimately, I believe in building with the end in mind. So a lot of times we'll build out the final outcomes at the very beginning. Here at Udacity, for example, we actually build our hands-on project at the beginning of the process. We actually build out the project and then we put it at the beginning and say, okay, now we're going to get our way to this project. It allows us to be focused at that outcome all the time. But ultimately, all the different experiences along the way should be thought through. What is the right way to deliver this? Should this be a hands-on activity, or should this be an expert interview where I just listen to a case study? Should this be a piece in thinking about all those experiences along? What's the best way of conveying this particular learning object? We used to think about it at Linda. We used to think about it in terms of how am I conveying each individual learning element and make that the video. So rather than having 2 or 3 concepts covered in every video, we have one video for each concept. So if you want to come back and get that one piece of information, it's right there. And the same thing applies when you're building content, even at a company like Udacity, where you're building larger content. Each learning element has to be consumable on its own so that a learner can get through it and then come back to it later and say, I can just pick up from where I was without saying, I've got to go back and relearn the last 10 minutes. And so being able to convey, knowing how the learner is going to work through the experience. Learners aren't going to sit for 7 or 8 hours at a time. They're going to sit through smaller stages now. How do you build content that allows them to get to a certain section and then jump out and then jump back in? And so building in that way, understanding the learner, understanding the experience, makes building the content a lot easier and a lot better.
And that makes a lot of sense. I would imagine because of the scale of content that you produce, having the right business processes and being efficient is extremely important to you and your team. That you don't necessarily hear that from everyone in the industry. There's a lot of focus on operationalizing L&D right now, making sure that teams can operate at the most efficient and effective with the most efficient and effective methods. What do you think is holding the industry back right now? What are some of the biggest operational challenges that you're seeing within L&D?
Yeah. So one of the things that I see a lot is people people on the development side of things who are building the materials wanting to hold on to every single part of the process. Only I can do this part, only I can do that part. Where when you really want to scale, you have to look at what are some shared program or parts of the process where I can bring in 2 experts to do the work of 3 or 4 or 5 non-experts. And that can be different tooling, that can be a new product, that can be a new process, but it oftentimes is expertise. One of the things that we saw in previous companies has been the editing process, actual editing of video or editing of text. If you're an instructional designer, you might say, I'm really good at writing and reading, and so I'll be a good editor. And that might be true. Editing is a different skill set than teaching or writing, but maybe you are a good editor. But the odds of you being as good a video editor as a professional video editor are not as good. And so if you really want to scale and get videos done quicker, we saw if you were building a lot of content, scale the teams to build expertise and let the people focus on what they're really good at. I see this a lot of time working with subject matter experts as well. A lot of times we'll ask subject matter experts to do a lot of things, but they may not be enough of an instructional designer to understand it. And so giving them very simple processes. Hey, write me 250 words about this. Okay, can you summarize that in 50 words or less? Giving them that kind of roadmap is a lot easier for them because they don't have to think about it as much as if you said to them, I need you to do this thing, and while you're doing it, also do these other things. That might not be in their wheelhouse. Writing good questions is maybe not something a subject matter expert can do, but you can give that to somebody who does instructional design and they can knock that out in less than a minute. So that's one of the things I look at. If you're trying to scale, look at the areas where you can put real experts or real processes in place to help that scale, rather than putting a lot of load on people who aren't the people that can scale.
Because, one of the challenges that we hear with L&D teams is like how to efficiently collaborate with the subject matter experts as well, right? And do you have some sort of playbook, or have you created any standards to work with subject matter experts? And like, what has worked? You've worked with subject matter experts your entire career, given your roles.
Yeah.
What has worked the best for you? Following on to what you just said about smaller nuggets of tasks.
Yeah, one of the things that helped really early was treat experts as in their expertise as experts. Make sure they understand that you're the expert in what you do. So I very early made sure that when I was working with even a book author on a large publishing company, that book author they knew that I thought that they were an absolute expert in that topic, but they weren't an editor, and they didn't do the book layout, and they didn't do color design. Like, that was our expertise as the publisher. And I've taken that through every company I've worked at, where I understand that you're an expert in digital design and you're going to build a course with us on digital design. I'm an expert in building content to be delivered online as online learning content. And if we work together well, it'll be amazing. If I tell you what to do inside your content and you tell me what to do inside of the pedagogical content, we're going to have friction and it's going to be difficult. What I want to do is acknowledge that the individual has expertise in what their subject is, and they acknowledge that I have expertise in what my role is. And then you have a much better deal.
So it's really establishing rules of engagement in that partnership as well.
Yeah. And most subject matter experts are completely understanding of that, because that's not their expertise. If you show them, here are all the things that I'm going to have to do while you're writing that script for that particular video or working on that question or that exercise, here are all things that I have to do. Most of them will say, yeah, I don't want to do that part. Okay, well, now you're acknowledging I'm an expert in this, you're an expert in that. Let's work together. And that allows you to kind of work as partners rather than the other kinds of relationships which you can get into. And I've taught my instructional designers to wear all the possible different hats. Is it a coach athlete relationship? Is it a professor student relationship? Is it the drill sergeant soldier relationship? Because you have to motivate your subject matter expert in different ways. But if you have that partnership bond at the beginning where everyone understands what the roles are, ultimately, no matter how you have to motivate them, it's going to be helpful.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And when we speak to instructional designers or learning and development managers, and we hear from time to time people complaining it's so hard to get engagement from our subject matter experts. I always naturally think about they haven't yet set up a proper partnership model to have those rules of engagement where, so the subject matter expert naturally thinks that they're not investing time wisely. And the reality is they're not without those rules of engagement, without having clear outcomes on like, what are we trying to accomplish here together? And what is this going to benefit if I'm putting my name on this? What do we get to do? Who are we helping because of this? And usually if it's mission driven, which a lot of times learning and content is, people for the most part like helping other people, so you can get their commitments pretty easily as long as there's clear outcomes and partnerships established along the way.
One of my early relationships with a subject matter expert, we had this very complex form they had to fill out, and it was just very time consuming for them, and it was the wrong platform for them, and it was I finally just said, hey, look, just write it, type it, and send it in to me. I don't care how you get me the content. Like, I can't write the content myself. I'm not a subject matter expert. But if you literally just type it and send it to me, I can make it dance. But I can't make it dance until you give me the content. And so them being frustrated by the format or the structure that was coming to them because it was more obtuse or it didn't work for them, that was just a barrier. And so if I could eliminate all those barriers, it was actually going to make the relationship better for them. And because the relationship was better for them, they were easier to work with for me. And we built that partnership relationship where they understood it's going to take some work on my end, but if you send this to me in this easy way, I can easily work with it. And I think that's what ultimately building that relationship is that some subject matter experts are going to be 100% down with doing whatever you want them to do and be great at it. And others are going to have things that this doesn't fit into my modality. And you just have to find ways to, like, how can I get what I need from them in a way that's usable? I used to say that I don't need my authors or instructors to be perfect. I need them to be editable. So if I can go in there and edit it and make it better, whether it's video or text or electronic pieces or whatever it is, if I can clean it up, everyone's going to win because they're going to have great content coming out with their name on it. And I'm going to be able to build the content that I'm going to need to build.
That makes a lot of sense. So when working with the subject matter experts, because of the content you're creating as well being video, I would assume that it's going to take a lot longer, or they're investing more time to film and prepare. And sometimes with video, you don't even know what the timelines are going to be ultimately. So, how do you communicate that with them to have those partnerships and those rules of engagement established to keep them motivated and committed throughout the process?
So one of the best ways we've discovered over the various companies is to have a template that you give them out from the very outset. Hey, this particular piece of content we're expecting it to be this long. It's going to have this many different components. Each component is broken down this to this many minutes or this many exercises or whatever it's going to be. And we give them kind of that structure so that they can understand in 9 times out of 10, this is the schedule that you can expect to do. And it's only in the 10th, the 1 out of 10, where something comes up that throws a wrench into this. And so that level of confidence that they get from that is, oh, okay, cool. I'm definitely one of the 9 out of 10. I'm not the 1 out of 10 person that's going to cause trouble. So I'm going to be on this regular schedule. And you just work with them to make sure they stay on that schedule, whatever it is. Can you deliver for me, 1,000 words by the end of next week? Can you record 5 videos by Tuesday? Giving them meaningful, especially at the beginning, meaningful, small, achievable goal milestones, because then they gain confidence and believe in you and believe in the template, and then you can get them to stretch a little bit. The where it goes sideways is almost always when you have a super rigid schedule that they have a lot of things to deliver very early, which is often very common. Hey, I got to have this first, that first, that first. So we have to get going. We need all these things right away. That can be overwhelming to a subject matter expert that's never worked in that way before. And so they then start not achieving their goals, the milestones that you give them. And now they're behind, and you're constantly coming to them saying, why are you behind? They can hear it in your voice that you're disappointed with them or angry with them. And you want to stay away from that, especially early in the relationship. You want to build a strong relationship based on success. And after you get them to succeed on their with your shorter deliverables, they'll feel like they have a little more runway, and you can let the reins go a little bit and say, okay, now I need you to succeed for the next 2 weeks on your own. Now I need all of this stuff done. You know what you're doing. You know how to write it. You know what I'm looking for. You've seen my edits. You've seen my suggestions. Keep going. That's, I think, a very successful. That way you breed success, and success breeds more success.
And to collaborate, especially with micro tasks, I would I would assume that visibility, having clear sight into transparency, all of that is going to be really, really important to keep things on time, within budget, on track. And earlier you also talked about data being important. So what processes are you putting in place to maintain that visibility, that high productivity, to get to the outcomes that are intended?
Yeah, so I mean, we track how long each subject matter expert takes to build each component. So that allows us to tell, long term, to be able to tell an instructor or a subject matter expert, hey, the last time you built with us, it took you, a week and a half to build one of these, and now you did it in a week. That's amazing. That's fantastic. High five. That we're breeding success. But we do that because we have that. We can share the data back to them. We can also share data on the success or outcomes of the content that's there. So we can say, oh, learners love it. They're running through this content and doing great in the final projects. And they can share that. And again, breeding confidence in how well learners are learning about it, rather than just being a black box to them. People love to feel successful. And the more you can share successes with them, the more likely you are to get more from them. I think that using data on the build process, how much time we as the instructional team take to build process, even setting up the template for programs, like monitoring that time, how long is it taking us to build the project, how long does it take us to do the finalization steps, tracking all of that helps us breed the confidence of, hey, we're doing it better than we did before. Or if we start to see things slip, we can start to identify it's this phase that's slipping and look into, is there something we have to change in the process? Is it something that's too complex? Is it something that's too obtuse? And what can we do to make it clearer for everyone so we can get back on schedule, or even increase our schedule somehow?
And how do you manage the different components to the process? Because there's a lot of collaboration with the SMEs, a lot of collaboration with the production team. What are some of do you think technology is the way to solve this? And what are you doing today to to maintain it and maintain that visibility and the efficiency as well?
Yeah, there's an absolute need when you're doing this at a team level, where you're not an individual instructional designer building on your own. When you're doing this as a team where you've got multiple stakeholders or multiple process steps with multiple teams, you have to have a centralized source of truth. There has to be one place where everybody goes and can see the status of any program during the process, at any stage of the process, with enough notes or links to tell us what exactly is happening this week. Without that, it turns into giant games of telephone. Hey, I just want to check in on this, and that person responds, and oh, what about this? And it's much easier to have a centralized source of truth. And so, some companies we've worked with, I've worked at, have had a centralized content management system that we've built out, just tons of additional features and functionality to manage things down to the individual script line level. And other companies have just had, honest to God, a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet kind of works in a certain extent. Sometimes you can start in the spreadsheet world and realize that my spreadsheet's no longer capable of handling this much data, and you need to move into something that's a little more robust. But for me, having that centralized place where everything can come out of, where whether I'm on the strategy side of things or the SME introduction / invitation side of things or the production side of things, it's all in one place. So anybody involved in the project can see, hey, this is coming, be ready because in 3 weeks it's going to be coming into your world. Or, hey, that thing that you worked on 2 months ago is finally in the finalization stage. So get ready to celebrate. Like, all of that is really important. And having a centralized place is critical for that. And publicly not outwardly facing, but publicly facing. So if you're working with internal SMEs, they can see the status of things too. The leadership of their teams can see statuses of that. So if you're grabbing subject matter experts from, let's say, an engineering team on a regular basis, that the leadership of that team can see their subject matter experts' involvement in the process, so they can report back and say, hey, our team has helped build 25 new courses for onboarding. All of that's super important to make that super visible, so that everyone can kind of share in the success and be accountable if there's things that are not succeeding.
Because of your, the culture and celebrating that you've developed, and celebrating successes and the wins is a big component to the high productivity. Is there, just naturally curious, is there a way to kind of gamify things to get the engagement and offer people points or anything like that to keep the high motivation?
Sure.
Have you ever seen something like that?
Sure. I have seen people that like achieving their schedule by a day, 2 days. Maybe they get 5 points per day. They beat the schedule. But then you have to balance that with like the quality side of it, because it's really easy to build fast. It's not easy to build quality, but you have to do both. I oftentimes tell the story about schedules where, and a lot of times, a lot of companies we work in, you miss it by a day, you miss it by a week. It's not a huge deal, especially if you're building for internal. And so, but when you're building externally, sometimes it can be a big deal. So I worked for McGraw-Hill. We were publishing a high school textbook, and we had a drop dead date to get that content, those books into the book depository by a certain date. And if we missed it, it was tens of millions of dollars lost. Like, those are real drop dead dates. Standing next to a giant web press and having a giant red button to stop the presses, like, those are real consequences. Missing a thing by a day or two may not seem like a lot, but you have to build a culture of accountability along with a culture of celebration to say, those days we established, those schedules we established them for a reason, because we either want to market it internally or hand it off to a team so they can do their onboarding, or if we're trying to do leadership training, that we want to roll it out to the C-suite and make sure they all have it on a certain date. Like, it's important to build to a schedule, because otherwise you just get sloppy in terms of how you're building.
And how about measuring the quality? How do you go about that? And when do you know when to iterate it? Are there feedback loops established or
Yeah, so there's a couple of different kinds of quality that you can measure. One is kind of what I think of as kind of the content / production quality, right? Like, how clean is your content? Typos, is the audio for your video very good? Is your graphics solid? Or so you have some kind of those intrinsic, in some ways, artistic quality side of things. But then you have pedagogical quality. Is the content conveying what you want it to convey in the time at which it should? And are learners actually utilizing that information in a meaningful way 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter after it's been delivered to them? Do they go back to it and learn more? Do they have to go back and rewatch the same video 2 or 3 times to kind of get the concepts right? Do you see them answering questions wrong because the information is not presented in a way that helps them understand it? And so we actually at Udacity, for example, have built a pedagogical checklist of quality that we expect all of our content to be delivered within. And that gets into how often we ask questions, what kinds of questions we ask, what kinds of taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy level we're trying to achieve with those questions. Are we providing adequate feedback to questions? So it's not just you got it wrong, but why did you get it wrong? And is it pushing you to the right answer? Delivering text summaries of some of our more complex videos to make sure that people understand or can follow up and, okay, now I get it. Here's a Cliff Notes version of it. And so there's pedagogical quality things that we can put forward that are super important to get. And I'm not going to share everything, but there's certainly a lot of them on our checklist. And so measuring both of those things is very important. But it's also good to know when a particular type of content doesn't need a certain level of quality. I'll give you a good example of that. When we built video training content, how to do video production at Lynda, the production quality of those videos had to be extremely high because we're teaching video production. So you couldn't have bad audio or bad shots if you're teaching video production. Nobody would think you're credible. If you're teaching a concept that maybe not as critical to video production, you maybe don't need as high a production quality, and people will not necessarily acknowledge it. And so being aware that what the audience could be looking for means that you don't necessarily have to have the same level of quality. You can always shoot for the best quality, but there are times when the acceptable quality level might be a little bit lower.
This conversation's been really interesting to learn about, the culture of success, accountability, quality, and the type of effort that goes into high content production, especially for customer facing content and learning. From a technology perspective, what are you seeing that is really helping to streamline some of these processes and really help innovate the work effort that your team's doing to get into that scaling of operations and being able to achieve everything that you're looking to achieve? Because, like you said, there's an ongoing list.
Yeah. It used to be I would talk to vendors that had some kind of technology that they thought would help. And at the end of the conversation, I would always say, but what if I used it like this? And it would be something that'd be so far out of their normal realm of workflow. They'd be like, well, I don't think we can actually do that. Okay, well, then they're not helpful. And so I think the solution we did at a couple of companies was build your own. And I think the building your own was fine at the beginning, but then it becomes, I think of it as an oak tree. It's really nice and strong at the beginning, but then pretty soon these branches get really wide and you need to hold them up with sticks. And so it becomes very difficult and unwieldy as it gets bigger. Working with a partner like yourself that we've been talking about for years, and working with someone who understands the process of learning, but also how do the operations of that learning work internally, allows a company to scale in a more effective way. Understanding that these two things or these four things are interrelated and they're all feeding into the same centralized database or centralized process makes the entirety of the process easier to run. Understanding, for example, that a subject matter expert that knows these three topics could also help you in another way, reviewing somebody else's work or suggesting what the next thing we should be working on. And so being able to engage them in multiple ways, in multiple paradigms, it's critical to a business being successful, whether it's building for internal use or external use. I think of my internal customers as customers as well, whether they're wearing a Udacity shirt or wearing a shirt at another company. They're still customers to me. They're still consuming my content. And so the process by which, the quality by which we build it is the same. The The speed at which we're doing it might be different, or the scale at which we're doing it might be different, but the processes I want to do for it are the same. And so, yeah, having technologies that can kind of bring all those things together and be able to customize that content to fit my exact workflow. Like, for example, if I'm working at a company that doesn't do video production, we're just building the content. I don't want to have to force myself into a new module, but being able to say, I build content and that turns into a script, and that script goes into a video workflow that has a storyboard, and the same content goes along and fills out in the right places. That's the kind of tool that makes an enormous difference to a multifaceted process like mine.
So just before wrapping up, Kirk, I'm curious to know what are some of your top, what are the top 3 priorities that you're focused on operationally to take your own learning operations to that next level?
Yeah, so one of mine, and this probably just comes from my background in history, is documentation in history. Like, there is nothing better than having long tenured employees who know where everything is buried. But invariably, you have to have documentation from those employees so that you know how things were done in the past, so you can iterate on it or make things better, or understand how a certain process works. And so documentation, operationally speaking, has always been critical for me. The second is having more, how do I say this? Having more engagement in how iteration can happen, rather than a single individual saying, I'm going to iterate and take a new process in a new direction, and that works for them, and that's great. But then they have to work with multiple people in their process. And so the more people are involved in the iteration as stakeholders, possibles, and then, tangential to that, being involved in the process, being aware that the process might change, allows you to get more views into how that process might be more efficient, even if the principal doesn't understand how they're delivering to the next step. And so process points, operationally speaking, I always try and get a couple of crosses involved in every process change so that you can see, is this going to be more effective? Is it going to affect the flow in a positive way? And the last is hire smart people. I've been super lucky in my career to bring in some really, really great people, and they oftentimes will just think around corners all the time about some other way to do something. Hey, I see that we've been doing it this way for a few years, but I was thinking, what if we did it more like this? And as we evolve our new content, what if we tried it this way? Get smart people to think about things. And so those are really my 3 things: documentation, build cross-functional kind of process teams, and then just have smart people thinking about it. For me, those are the operations.
I couldn't agree more. You can't run an effective business without people. And you definitely want to, for me at least, I'm always looking at hiring people who can teach us what to do and pull us into the next direction, and that gives us our competitive advantages. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. Well, Kirk, this has been really fun to talk about content production and learning operations with you. Really appreciate your time today, and excited to share your thought leadership with our audience.
Yeah, it's been great. I really appreciate the time, Ryan.
Thanks for watching today's LearnOps Leadership episode. For more episodes like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.